Just a few years before World War I, the Germans began to look to form an alliance with the Chinese and the Americans. This was mainly aimed against the growing Japanese power, but since the French and British had begun to side with the Japanese, this was set to make the First World War a very different affair. But more than that, there were some moves to get Russia involved in this treaty by giving them a free hand and taking back Manchuria and the likes. So of course, along with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Italy and the Ottomans, this would have been a powerful enough alliance to challenge the British and French. It also wasn't just an unbelievable dream of the Kaiser, who was growing more desperate for alliances in the early 20th century. Prominent Chinese people like the future leader Yuan Shikai was open to the idea, and for at least a while, so too was Teddy Roosevelt. So the world of alliances before World War I was a complete mess. One other potential alliance I would like to highlight is the Mediterranean Agreements of 1887. This was a treaty between Britain, Italy, Spain and Austria, which, in theory, was just protecting the status quo in southern Europe, but in practice it was aimed at halting Russian expansion in the Balkans and supporting Italian claims in North Africa against the French. Around the same time you also had the REINSURANCE Treaty, a secret treaty between the Germans and Russians. To maintain this alliance, the Germans agreed to support Russian influence in Bulgaria, and both agreed to remain neutral in case of a war against a third party. Plus add on top of that the Triple Alliance with Germany, Austria and Italy, and you can see why the Germans would be happy with the Mediterranean Agreements, as it brought Britain closer into this Triple Alliance and away from the French. But it should be said that Britain's chief rivals at that time were in fact Russia and France. There were of course colonial conflicts with the French in North Africa and Southeast Asia, then they contended with the Russians for influence in Central Asia during the Great Game, while in Europe they spent most of the 19th century propping up the Ottoman Empire from being invaded by the Russians. Then, if any of you saw my video on the scramble for China, the British were beginning to grow wary of Russian expansion into northern China, so Britain joining Germany, or at least the Austrians and Italians, could well have happened. However, Germany made a crucial mistake in 1890, and the Russians quickly formed an alliance with the French. This, being surrounded by enemies, was what Bismarck had been trying to avoid ever since coming to power. However, by now Bismarck had been removed from his post, and Kaiser Wilhelm changed Germany's policy. He began to look for more colonies, and hoped to expand into the Far East, notably taking Qingdao in China. But the British signed an alliance with the Japanese, and this Anglo-Japanese alliance became a dominant force in Asia, especially after Japan's successful war against the Russians. During the Russo-Japanese War, there was actually still hope of a German-Russian alliance, and Kaiser Wilhelm and Tsar Nicholas met to sign the Treaty of Byorko. Articles of this alliance included, in case one of the two empires is attacked by a European power, his ally will help it in Europe with all its land and sea forces. And also, the Emperor of all the Russians, after the entry into a force of this treaty, will take the necessary steps to initiate France to this agreement and engage it to join as an ally. So there was even still hope that France could have joined in as well. As I said, the pre-World War I alliances were a mess, and it seems that anybody could have been allies. In this case it was Russia, France and Germany maybe against Britain and Japan, or alternatively, Britain, Austria, Spain and Italy against Russia and France. Plus, keep in mind that the First World War began due to an assassination, so any trigger could really have started it years earlier. There were in fact many potential triggers like the Fashoda incident in 1898, which saw Britain and France nearly go to war over claims in the Sudan, or potentially the Venezuelan crisis in 1902, which saw the Americans diplomatically defend Venezuela against the Germans, British and Italians who all united. Then there was even the Samoan Civil War, which saw German and American warships in a standoff, but tensions were de-escalated because of a storm wrecking all of the ships. Gradually, however, the Germans cemented their position as the enemy of the British. The naval race in the early 20th century began to worry the British, and then the Kaiser angered them by congratulating the Boers in South Africa. So the Anglo-French Entente was signed, but this still wasn't necessarily a strong alliance. Britain still somewhat favoured isolationism, and since the Boer Wars wounded their prestige and feelings of invincibility, they rushed into alliances with the Japanese and the French. Plus, keep in mind most of these previous agreements that I've mentioned have failed, so the Entente could have went the same way. The Germans, however, made things worse again and strengthened the Entente with the First Moroccan Crisis of 1906. To briefly summarise this, France wanted to turn Morocco into a protectorate, and Germany decided that they would support the Sultan. but they had completely misread the situation. The crisis didn't drive a wedge between Britain and France as hoped, it in fact brought them closer together, and most of the great powers sided with the French, with the exception of Austro-Hungary. It also weakened the Triple Alliance, as even Italy sided with the French, and then the Spanish signed the Pact of Cartagena with the French and British. So in one fell swoop, most of the Mediterranean powers moved away from Germany, and to make things even worse, the British signed an alliance with the Russians, dividing Europe into two camps. Further afield, France and Russia also signed agreements with the Japanese in 1907, meaning in just a year, Germany had managed to surround themselves by enemies, all suspicious of their activity. So the Kaiser also began to look further afield for allies. One obvious potential ally was the Americans, and the Kaiser wrote to Prince Bernhard von Bülow, "My insurance treaty with Theodore Roosevelt, who is afraid of the Japanese, would be appropriate and worthy of consideration." And in terms of Asia, he spotted another obvious ally in China, writing again to von Bülow, "The Chinese have more self-respect than the Spanish, Portuguese and French. We must strengthen their backs and not betray their confidence. I am very much for this." This is particularly strange as the Kaiser had essentially led the charge into trying to partition China, and feared the growth of any Asian power. Plus in terms of America, it's also particularly strange, as just a few years beforehand, they had drawn up plans to invade or at least attack the United States. However, now that the Japanese had defeated the Russians, the Kaiser could use a new fear of Japan to entice the Americans into a potential alliance. Hermann Speck von Sternberg met with Roosevelt and reported to Bülow that Roosevelt was worried about Japan and trusted the Germans. According to von Sternberg, Roosevelt said, "If Japan invades America with powerful forces, our army will first suffer a crushing blow. Japan's army will be annihilated if she has left it in America, and America will take her revenge. In the history of American foreign representatives, no one has ever had more trust of our people as you do." So the Americans as well as the Germans expected that the major war wouldn't come from the Balkans, but from Japan. They theorized that Japan, Russia and maybe France would seek to partition China, and of course Germany and America would intervene on behalf of their Asian ally. As for Britain, Roosevelt said, "I do not think that she would intervene in such a war. England knows that in such a case, we would invade Canada." Yet from these notes it's clear that Roosevelt believed that the Americans needed some sort of major defeat in order to reorganize their army. So just like he predicted losing to the Japanese invasion on land and then eventually beating them back, he also refused to allow Germans to aid in a future war in the Americas. Both sides theorized that the Japanese could use Mexico as a base for an invasion of the United States, but as Roosevelt said, "No, our troops must fight the land war alone. The victory won for us by the German troops would be even more detrimental to our army. A fundamental reorganization of the army, according to my observation, is entirely impractical without a previous defeat, but I still have confidence in the American people." Meanwhile, over in China, the German ambassador Count von Rex came up with a new proposal. While keeping the secret understanding with the Americans, he said Russia would be allowed an entirely free hand, not only in Mongolia and East Turkestan, but also in Manchuria and Korea. Through this agreement, she would receive far more than the Japanese, French, English group has ever been induced to grant. So there was still hope in bringing Russia into the alliance, but at the expense of their other ally of China. The Kaiser even proposed to give Russia a free hand in Persia as well. While in China, one key supporter of the alliance was Yuan Shikai. He began to advocate for the alliance within the royal court, and in 1908, a Chinese diplomat was sent to Hawaii. However, by the time this diplomat had arrived, Empress Dowager Cixi had died, and Yuan Shikai's position was volatile. After advocating for this alliance for so long, his political position depended on it. However, unfortunately for Yuan, the Japanese sent Takahira to promote a Japanese-American friendship and maintaining the status quo. This finally pushed the Americans away from the German-Chinese alliance, and soon Yuan Shikai was removed from his post. Roosevelt then justified breaking away from China, saying that they are so weak that they were incapable of carrying out any fixed policy. He said a Sino-Japanese conflict would have found China entirely unprepared, and neither Germany nor America would have been ready in such a case to protect China against Japan. If it ever has to come to an American-Japanese war, this must happen for purely American interests. So it seems that the Americans were looking for allies in case they had to go to war against the Japanese. But Takahira's mission assured them no war was coming, so now Roosevelt was free to follow his desired policy of peace in Asia. Roosevelt would then leave office shortly afterwards, and Taft became president. He was far more concerned with Asia than Europe, but while Manchuria fell into Japan's sphere of influence, he was unwilling to wage war to uphold the open door policy in China. So obviously nothing came of this alliance. However, had it worked, maybe the Americans would have invaded Canada, British influence in Asia could have been pushed back, Japan could have been crippled or even partitioned, who knows what could have happened. And my question for you today is, can you think of any other strange potential alliances? One that comes to mind for me is the Franco-Mongol alliance, which aimed at pushing back the Muslim conquests. Leave yours in the comments below.